Thank you, everyone that participated. What a beautiful day to worship God and to remember the beautiful things that God has done for us. This remembering our Savior and the sacrifices that He made for us. We tend to talk about it in terms of a sacrifice. But I would beg to have you think about the life that He lived prior to offering His body as a sacrifice on the cross. That entire life was a sacrifice. That entire being present as a human being was a sacrifice because He existed in the form of God. He left that voluntarily to come to this earth and do what He did for me, for you, for everybody else that had sinned against Him. I would like for us to look at this reading that we had from Jake, and I also want to, my goal this morning was to, did I leave it at the pew? I had a list of the songs that we sang, and I wanted to, did I leave it there, Mom? Huh. Gracious. It's a good thing my head's attached. One of the things that impresses me so much about our singing is that a great deal of thought, meditation, just pondering the gospel and the plan of salvation has gone into the writing of these songs. And we talked about heaven last week, and I asked the guys to continue with the theme of heaven with our songs because I want to reflect on the songs that we sang today. I want to talk about what's in them, what it is that we gain from these things when we sing, when we teach and admonish one another with these psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. We're supposed to be teaching and encouraging one another, building each other up with these songs. I think it's important that we ponder the songs themselves and the words that are in them. And I know Mel agrees with me with that. Every time I say something about that, I see he's a bobblehead. I love the bobbleheads. I don't like these kind very much, but I sure love the bobbleheads. And what the first song that we sang this morning is a song about singing when all of God's singers get home. I've noticed that a lot of people don't really enjoy singing. Have you ever pondered how you're going to fit into heaven if you don't like to sing? This whole concept of singing is to show our pleasure. There's a term that is used just rampantly in the religious world, and it's called rapture. Does anybody know what the word rapture actually means? I know how it's used in the gospel. I know how it's used in the book of Revelation. I know that there's one place in the writings of the apostles that talks about rapture. I want you to turn to 1 Thessalonians, and I want us to see this for just a moment before we go on to talk more about other things in the songs. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we have a writing here where Paul is concerned about something that they have that they don't understand. They're not really sure about the second coming. They're worried because they have the view that if we're not living, if we're not still alive when the Lord comes back, if we died ahead of that time, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry you missed out. It sure would have been nice if you could have been here when it happened. Well, Paul doesn't want them to have this view that if you die ahead of time, you're going to miss out. He says, we don't want you to be uninformed, brethren. What's the other word for that, uninformed? Ignorant. I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. Now, No hope is when you're dead all over, just like Rover. When you die, that's the end of everything. Well, Paul didn't want them to have that feeling that if you missed out on the second coming, you were missing out on everything that was promised. So he says, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and that's what we've been talking about all this morning, is Jesus dying and being raised. And that's where our hope is. It's in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's the fact that He died and He was buried so that I could die with Him, put that old man of sin to death, and we could be raised to walk in a new life and have the opportunity of a resurrection when this physical life is over. He says, if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with Him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. Well, you read in the Bible about what happens when a person dies. When we die, that is physically when we die, the body falls over and it eventually starts turning back to dirt, and the spirit returns to God's control. That's the way it works. So when it's in God's control, like Jesus said to the thief on the cross, this day you shall be with me in paradise. Well, that doesn't happen to everybody, but it's still under God's control. So what he's talking about here is that when those people who died, they went back to God's control, and that's in keeping with Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes says when a man dies, his body returns to the dirt, and the spirit returns to God's control. This says, though, when the Lord comes back again, He's going to bring with Him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. And there's a reason they're coming back. And that is the resurrection. He says, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. Now, if you have the King James, it says we shall not prevent those. One of the good reasons why there's a new translation. Because prevent doesn't mean the same thing now that it did then. Prevent meant, like a gentleman would say to a lady at the door, prevent me. Go out ahead of me. We will not. No one will go out ahead of anybody else. It says, for the Lord Himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will be caught up together with them in the air to meet the Lord. And thus we shall always, in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord. This is the rapture. This is the being caught up. This is the being lifted up to meet the Lord in the air. This is the Bible rapture. But the word rapture now doesn't even mean that. Rapture now means a feeling. Means an intense feeling of bliss. Is what the word, if you look it up, I think that's what it'll say if you look it up in the dictionary. An intense feeling of bliss. Well, you know how it got that way? You know how it came to mean that? Because of what's waiting here. The whole concept of what they're headed for when they are being caught up to meet the Lord in the air. A paradise. You know what paradise means? Paradise. Parachute. Around, beside. It means a protected place. It means, actually, the very earliest meanings of that means a hedge around it. A protected place where nothing can harm you. Where no ill can befall. And all of the songs that we've been singing are about that place where no ill can befall. We sing no tears in heaven. no sorrows given. All will be glory in that land. Those are songs that I consider to be in the group that, we have 3 different categories of songs that are talked about. Both in Ephesians and Colossians, Paul mentions 3 different classes of songs: psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, my brother Mike, who was here with us in class, he has a slightly different take on this. And he voiced that. I'm going to stick with mine. I see these 3 different classes of music. The Psalms. If you read the book of Psalms, there's so much in the book of Psalms, you can't really categorize that. But there is one thing that stands out in every psalm that I see. And that is the greatness, the grandeur, the majesty of God. And David never in any of his psalms fails to bring out that first of all, and then there may be other things that he talks about in the psalms, but that's, you can get that in every one of them. The greatness of our Father in heaven. And then there's the hymns. Hymns. I know that there's an overlapping of these things, and hymns have to do with a lot of the same things. Hymns talk about the greatness of God, but there's an element to the hymns that you don't find in all of the Psalms, and that is this rousing to battle, this call to arms, this ability to get yourself ready for the fight. And all of the songs that we sing about Christian soldiers arise. Put the battle armor on. All of these things that have to do with getting ready for a tough fight. Those are the hymns that we sing. But when you sing No Tears in Heaven, earlier we were talking about, in class, we were talking about fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Well, he was fixing his eyes at the same time. These spiritual songs that we sing are those kind of songs that help us to look past the trouble, look past the pain, look past all of the distractions, and to see the goal. Understand that that's what we're working for. I can't talk about spiritual songs without thinking about the old Negro spirituals. They had something very physical that they had to look beyond. When you tell the story of someone who's in a cotton field, I've been in a cotton field. I'll tell you what's worse than a cotton field is a tobacco field. I worked tobacco and I looked like a different race when I got out of the field. Because that stuff will turn you dark. It's a nasty place to work. I can't imagine the rigors of that work. And on top of that, having somebody beating me in the process. I can't imagine the agonies that there would be in being owned by someone else and having them dictate who I married, where my children went. Everything about that existence must have been miserable. And that's why they had some of the songs that they had. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. You know those stories that we have that are accounts of what has happened with God's people in the past. I want you to think about how someone in a position that is barely tolerable would look at these songs and the stories in the Bible, such as the story of Elijah, where Elijah is a man of God. He had gone through so much in service to God, and he didn't even die. Elisha, his apprentice, watched him as a chariot came down and swooped him up and took him to heaven. Wow. I can imagine that would be something that would be in your imagination. Swing low, sweet chariot, come to take me home. And it would give the idea that death actually was that rescue from this miserable life. And it's not just the Negroes of our past that suffered those kind of things. It was the Christians in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries that suffered those kind of things so terribly. And I can imagine that they sang songs that were looking beyond the trouble and waiting patiently for God to bring that rescue, whether that was by death or whether it was some other instrument during life. God will rescue the righteous and punish the wicked. It's what every prophecy in the Bible is all about. I don't care when they originally were talking about. Every prophecy in the Bible has to do with two things for you and me. That is, that God will not neglect to rescue the righteous and punish the wicked. Now, we sing other songs. We sing other songs that teach and admonish us in different ways. I want to go back to our story that Jake read this morning, because that's what I want to finish this all about. We sang 2 songs this morning that I want to talk about that have to do with that. The way of the cross leads home. I want you to turn back to that, if you would. I think that's 616, and I left my book, naturally. Number 616. I want us to just ponder how this song is worded. I must needs go home. First thing that hits me about that story of the prodigal son is it's me. It's me. Plain and simple, I am the prodigal son. If you're female, I guarantee you're the prodigal daughter. Because we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Some of us worse than others. Some of us have a long journey back. Forgiveness is not long, but the journey back can be really, really arduous. What this song teaches: I must go home. There's only one road, by the way of the cross. There's no other way but this. I shall ne'er get sight of the gates of light if the way of the cross I miss. Peter made the statement in Acts, that in chapter 4, there is no other name given among men by which we must be saved. And the reason for that is that there's no other person that had the qualifications to wash my sins and yours away. So if we miss the way of the cross, we've missed it all. I must needs go on in the blood-sprinkled way, the path that the Savior trod. If I ever climb to the heights sublime, where the soul is at home with God, then I must bid farewell to the way of the world, to walk in it nevermore. For my Lord says, come. And I seek my home where He waits at the open door. Can you see this story of the prodigal son in this? He gets out there and he's looking for a good time. Yeah, I've been there. I've been there. I remember that good time. I remember being with my friend, a guy from Guatemala. The youngest man I have ever met with false teeth. Uppers and lowers. Never met anybody in their early 20s with all their teeth gone. Not even in Florida. Beautiful tooth you got there, darling. We went out partying. And I don't know how we got back home, but we did. And I see my friend the next morning, and he's all like this. I said, "Where's your teeth?" He said, "Somewhere in the sewer system." He threw up in the toilet overnight, flushed his teeth down the toilet. We're having fun. I look back at that and I wonder, what was I thinking? I know this man in Luke woke up one day and said, what am I thinking? This is not fun. I'm dying here. I look back at my dad's house and everybody that works for him has way more than I have. What am I doing here? You know what that's what you call an epiphany. Blink, the light comes on. What comes next? What comes next with this young man is where he figures that. He ponders that. He thinks about everything that's going on and he says, I got to go home. This is what I'm going to say. Dad, I was wrong. I was wrong. I'm not worthy to be called your son. I've sinned against you. I've sinned against God. Can I come home? Y'all know Bubba. You know Bubba. My son got into cocaine. Actually, I don't know whether you know about Bubba or not, but he was an unbelievable baseball player. As a junior in high school, he had scouts, pro scouts, at every game he played. They were just waiting for him to get out of high school, maybe college, but they were watching him the whole time. He got accepted for a special team that traveled all over the country, sponsored by an oil company in the Midwest. They traveled everywhere. He was as good as there were. He batted right and left, had just under a 400 average, both right and left. You couldn't get the ball past him. He was a shortstop or a second baseman, and he was good. Never missed the ball when it came to him. He even pitched a bit, had a 92-mile-an-hour fastball. He was an itty-bitty guy. Not this way, but he was itty-bitty this way. His coaches on that team got him on cocaine. The very thing he viewed to be the escape and the big deal was actually his downfall. And that continued for years. Until one night, I got a call. Very late at night. From a payphone somewhere in Modesto, California. Didn't even know there were still payphones. But he found one. And he called me. And that kid, which by the way, I might tell you, had the reputation for being the toughest snot-nosed kid in Pasco. He was a tough kid. But he was bawling his eyes out. He said, "Dad, I'm eating out of garbage cans." He said, "My life's a wreck." I said, "Well, son, do you know who wrecked it?" He said, "Yeah, it was me. I did it." I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" He says, "I've got to fix this or I'm going to die. Can I come home?" I hate to even talk about the times that I said no, because I did. There were times when he would call and want help. And I determined that my help would not be helping. So I'd say no. Finally, I saw in him what I thought I needed to see. That he wanted to come home. He didn't want me to help him do what he was doing. He wanted to come home. That's what the Father sees here in Luke. This young man knows that he did the wrong thing. He knows that his past life was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. He's not asking Dad to continue supporting him in his evil life. He's saying, "I want to come home." Now, when we recognize that we need to go home by the way of the cross, we're ready. We're ready. So this whole story, we're running out of time, but I want to go back to Luke for just a second here. We're not getting anywhere near as much done as I wanted to, but as we go back to Luke and look at this story, there's one thing that I want us to get out of this, and that is that we're not in this by ourselves. You know, it's almost like it's a footnote. But as you get down to the end of the chapter, and it talks about how the Father receives him. And he says, verse 31, he said to the oldest boy. Now, this is kind of interesting too, because the other one's kind of unhappy. He's jealous that his father's paying so much attention to the younger son. And I didn't notice at first, but there's what is said in this is really interesting. The older son says to the father, "You killed a fattened calf for him." Well, that's what they did. That's what they did when there was a real feast to be had. Well, when you read that and you notice what he says, "You have never done for me," he says, "You've never given me a goat." There's a big difference between a goat and a calf. He says, "You've never done the slightest thing for me." And here you're treating him like he's King Solomon come home. And that quite often is the problem that we have. It's much easier for us to grieve with those who grieve than to be happy about someone coming back. Always, not always, but sometimes we want to find a reason why they're not really coming back, why they're not really sincere. Rejoice. Rejoice. And that's what I see in this, because when you go back up to the story before, let's go back up to verse 10. Because there we're reading about the 99, or here, no, it's talking about the lost coin. About the woman who loses the coin. When she finds it, she rejoices. In verse 10 it says, in the same way, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Y'all want to see this kind of action and reaction? Come home with me and we'll eat lasagna while we watch the Seahawks play football. And I'm telling you, it gets raucous when we score a touchdown. You know why? Because our team won. Our team wins. Our team scored. And when we lose the ball, you knuckleheads, what are you doing? I mean, there's this range of emotions when we do what's wrong. When we insult the very Spirit of God that's out here trying to save us. When we do things that insult that whole effort. There's no rejoicing in that. But when one sinner says, can I come home? Can you imagine the rejoicing that there is in the whole panoply of God over that one sinner? Because that's the reason that Jesus came. It's the reason that we do what we do. It's the reason that we're born again. Because we want to go home. We want to go home. I'm tired. I want to go home. I'm tired of having the problems that this life presents. I'm not ready to leave tonight, but I want to go home. And that's exactly what these songs are all about. There's trouble in this life, but it doesn't have to get the best of us. There are problems that we have to overcome, but we can overcome them. We can be more than conquerors through Jesus Christ our Lord. So let's use these songs to encourage each other, to make sure that we know that there is a goal out there that we can keep our eyes focused on. And if you're subject to the gospel call this morning, won't you use this opportunity to focus your eyes on that goal, and let's go home. Come on, while we stand and sing.